The letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late September 1899, carried by a messenger whose horse had foam at its mouth from the hard ride from the harbor. Theodora Ashford.
You
Thea,
look
to the one
absolutely
person
stunning
who had
tonight.
ever truly
Thank
seen
you.
her,
You look very
stood at the
handsome
library
yourself.
window
May I have
of the
this dance?
family's Beacon Hill townhouse, watching autumn leaves spiral down onto Lewisburg Square like amber coins falling through water. She was
This night
22
is for
years old.
you.
She had
It's
spent
beautiful,
3 of
may
those
I?
years loving a
course.
man who
I
lived
feel it's
3,000
magic.
miles across an ocean. The envelope bore a British postmark and a ducal seal pressed into burgundy wax. Her hands trembled as she broke it open. Not because she didn't recognize the handwriting, she would have known those precise, elegant strokes anywhere, but because in 3 years of correspondence, Harrison Whitmore had never once written to her family, only to her. 23 letters exchanged between Boston and Cambridge, England. Each one a continuation of a conversation that had begun on a cold October afternoon in 1896 and had never truly ended. The letter was addressed to her father. Thea's chest tightened. She read it once, then again, then a third time, each word carving itself into her memory like a chisel into marble. Mr. Marcus Ashford, I am writing to request the honor of calling upon your family during my forthcoming visit to Boston. I have business interests in American shipping routes that I believe may prove mutually beneficial. I arrive on the 28th of September and would be pleased to discuss these matters at your earliest convenience. Your servant, Harrison Whitmore, Duke of Ashford. Business interests, shipping routes. The words were perfectly proper, utterly impersonal. But Thea knew or thought she knew what they meant, what they had to mean. He was coming back. 3 years ago, she had been 19 years old and hungry for ideas the way other women her age hungered for romance. Her father's library had been her refuge since childhood, those endless shelves of leather-bound volumes, her true family. Philosophy, political theory, history, science, she had consumed them all, with the focused intensity of someone starving in a house full of food no one else could see. The lecture series at Harvard had been her mother's idea, though for all the wrong reasons. The university occasionally allowed respectable ladies to audit certain talks provided they sat in the back and asked no questions. It was considered educational, a way to make young women more interesting conversationalists at dinner parties. Thea's mother had hoped it might make her daughter less difficult, less consumed by books, less indifferent to the social performances that came so naturally to her older sister Rosalie. It hadn't worked. The lecturer that afternoon had been a visiting professor from Cambridge, 30 years old, with dark hair, touched with premature silver at the temples, and eyes that seemed to see straight through the world's comfortable lies. Harrison Whitmore. Even then, before she knew he was a duke, before she knew anything about him except the brilliant fire of his mind, she had been unable to look away. His topic was Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Most of the audience, respectable Boston matrons and their daughters, had shifted uncomfortably in their seats as he quoted Wollstonecraft's most radical passages. That women were not naturally inferior to men. That denying women education was not protection, but imprisonment. That treating half the human race as decorative objects was a moral catastrophe. Thea had sat in the back row, her hands gripping the edge of her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. Finally, someone was saying aloud the thoughts that had burned in her mind for years. The thoughts she had learned to keep silent because speaking them only made her family look at her with that particular blend of concern and disappointment. After the lecture, she had done something she had never done before. Something that even now, 3 years later, she could hardly believe she had possessed the courage to do. She had approached him. The memory was so vivid she could still feel the tremor in her legs as she walked down that aisle, could still hear the rustle of her gray wool dress, the plainest thing she owned, chosen deliberately because she had no interest in being seen as anything other than a mind seeking another mind. Most of the audience had already fled scandalized or bored. A few elderly professors remained arguing with Harrison about the dangerous implications of his thesis. Thea had waited, patient, invisible. A skill she had perfected over 22 years of being the disappointing second daughter. When the professors finally departed, shaking their heads, Harrison had begun gathering his papers. She had cleared her throat. He had looked up, and something had shifted in the air between them, like a door opening onto a landscape she had never imagined existed. Sir, she had said, her voice steadier than she felt. Your interpretation of Wollstonecraft's argument about rational capacity, I believe you understated her case. His eyebrows had risen, not in offense but in surprise, and unless she had imagined it, delight. Did I, he had said, please elaborate. What followed was 2 hours. 2 hours in that empty lecture hall, pacing between rows of seats, arguing, challenging, building on each other's thoughts with the kind of intellectual electricity she had only ever experienced alone with books. He had quoted Locke. She had countered with Kant. He had raised the question of natural rights. She had demolished 3 centuries of assumptions about gendered reason. At some point, darkness had fallen outside the tall windows. At some point, they had both sat down, leaning toward each other across a scarred wooden desk, their voices low and urgent, as if the ideas passing between them were precious contraband that might be confiscated if discovered. "You have," Harrison had said, finally, his voice rough with something she couldn't name, "the finest mind I have encountered in America. Perhaps anywhere." The words should have sounded like flattery. They didn't. They sounded like recognition. Like someone finally seeing her. "I leave for England tomorrow," he had continued, and something in Thea's chest had cracked. "But I wonder, would you permit me to write to you? I find myself wanting to continue this conversation." She had said yes. Of course she had said yes. The letters had begun 3 weeks later. At first, they were careful intellectual debates about Mill's new essay on representative government, discussions of American versus British constitutional theory, arguments about whether Rousseau's social contract was philosophically coherent. But over time, between the lines of philosophical discourse, something else had begun to grow. Something neither of them had named, but both of them had felt. She had never told her family about the letters. They arrived addressed to Miss T. Ashford, and she collected them personally from the post office, reading them in the privacy of her room, writing responses late at night by candlelight. 23 letters in 3 years. She had kept everyone tied with a blue ribbon hidden in the false bottom of her trunk, and now he was coming back. But not for her. For business, for shipping routes, for her father. The library door opened. Thea turned from the window, hastily folding the letter. Her mother stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands twisting together in that nervous gesture that had become more frequent in recent months. "Thea," Margaret Ashford said, "your father needs to see you, both of you and Rosalie." There was something in her mother's voice, something that made the bottom drop out of Thea's stomach. "What's happened?" Thea asked. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "Everything," she whispered. "Everything has happened." The study smelled of tobacco and desperation. Marcus Ashford stood behind his desk, a man who had once carried himself with the easy confidence of inherited wealth, now stooped as if under a physical weight. The desk itself was covered in papers, legal documents, bank statements, letters with ominous seals. Beside the fireplace, a man in a sober black suit stood with the patient stillness of an executioner waiting for the appointed hour. Thea entered behind her sister. Rosalie moved like a swan, even in distress, 25 years old, golden-haired, blessed with the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their own feet. She had been the center of every room since her debut at 18. The perfect daughter, the one who had never had to try to be seen. "Sit," their father said. His voice was hoarse. They sat. Thea chose the hardback chair near the bookshelf. Rosalie took the cushioned settee, her hands folded gracefully in her lap, her face composed. But Thea saw the tension in her sister's shoulders, the way her fingers gripped each other too tightly. "This is Mr. Pemberton," their father said, gesturing to the man in black. "Our family solicitor. He has been helping me understand the extent of our situation." "Sir," Rosalie said, her voice musical even in worry. "What situation?" Marcus Ashford closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he looked 10 years older. "I have ruined us," he said simply. "The railroad speculation, the investments in Western expansion. I was certain, everyone was certain, that the returns would be extraordinary. But the panic of '93, he trailed off. "I mortgaged everything. The shipping business, this house, the Newport estate. I borrowed against future earnings that never materialized." The room was very quiet. Outside, a carriage passed on the cobblestones, the sound of hooves like a heartbeat. "How much?" Thea heard herself ask. Mr. Pemberton answered, his voice professionally neutral. $470,000, Miss Ashford. Due in 6 months. If unpaid, your father's creditors will seize all assets. The title remains, but everything else, the properties, the income, the business, will be forfeit." Rosalie made a small sound, quickly stifled. Thea sat perfectly still, her mind racing through calculations. $470,000. It might as well have been $4 million. There was no way to earn that sum. No way to borrow it, not with their credit already extended beyond all reason. No honest way. "There is," their father said, and Thea heard the shame in his voice. "One possibility, a solution that Mr. Pemberton and I have discussed." He picked up a letter from his desk. The letter, the one with the ducal seal. A British peer is coming to Boston. A duke with substantial holdings in England and business interests in American trade. He is unmarried. He is... Marcus Ashford's voice cracked. He is our only hope. Understanding crashed over Thea like a wave of ice water. No, she said. Rosalie, their father continued, as if Thea hadn't spoken, turning to his elder daughter. You are 25. Beautiful. Accomplished. Everything a nobleman could want in a wife. If he could be persuaded to... You want to sell me, Rosalie said flatly. All the music had gone out of her voice. Not sell, their mother interjected quickly, desperately. Never that, just make an advantageous match. Dukes need wives. You would be a duchess. And if he were to settle your father's debts as part of the marriage settlement, well, that would simply be the generous act of the Duke's name, Thea interrupted, though she already felt the universe collapsing to a single point of terrible clarity. What is his name? Her father looked at her for the first time. Really looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, haunted. Harrison Whitmore, he said, Duke of Ashford. The world tilted. Thea gripped the arms of her chair, her nails digging into the wood. Harrison, her Harrison, the man she had loved for 3 years through letters and memory, and the ghost of a 2-hour conversation. Coming here, coming to be offered her sister like a prize at auction. He arrives in 4 days, her father continued. I've arranged a dinner. Rosalie, you must be perfect. Everything depends on you. Everything. Rosalie said nothing. Her face had gone pale, her eyes distant. Thea knew that look. Her sister was retreating into herself, becoming the beautiful object their father needed her to be. The thing she had been trained to become since birth. And Thea, her father added almost as an afterthought, you will need to stay out of the way. This is Rosalie's chance, the family's chance. We cannot afford any distractions. Stay out of the way. Be invisible. It was not a new instruction. Thea had been following it her entire life. But this time something in her chest refused to accept it. This time the man walking into the trap her father had set was Harrison Whitmore. The man who had called her mind extraordinary. The man whose letters had been the brightest hours of 3 years of gray existence. She stood abruptly. May I be excused? Her father waved a hand, already turning back to Mr. Pemberton and his papers. Already forgetting she was in the room. Thea walked out of the study with her spine straight and her hands steady. She made it all the way to her bedroom before the tears came. The knock on her door came 2 hours later, after the dinner gong had sounded and gone unanswered. After the house had settled into its evening rhythms, her parents closeted in the study, still servants moving quietly through darkened halls. Thea, Rosalie's voice soft through the wood. May I come in? Thea sat up on her bed, wiping at her eyes. Yes. Her sister entered like light entering a dark room. Even in distress, even with her own face showing signs of tears, Rosalie was luminous. She wore a dressing gown of ivory silk, her golden hair loose around her shoulders. She looked like a princess from a storybook. She looked like exactly what their father needed her to be. Rosalie sat on the edge of Thea's bed, studying her younger sister's face with an intensity that was rare for her. Usually Rosalie moved through life with a kind of pleasant detachment, as if the world were a stage and she merely an actress performing her assigned role. But tonight something was different. Tonight she looked present, real. You know him, Rosalie said, not a question. Thea's breath caught. What? The Duke, Harrison Whitmore. When father said his name, you looked like you'd been struck. So I'll ask again, you know him. There was no point in lying. Rosalie had always been more observant than people gave her credit for. People assumed because she was beautiful that she must be simple. They were wrong. Yes, Thea whispered. I know him. Tell me. So Thea told her about the lecture, about the 2 hours that had changed everything, about the letters, 23 of them hidden in her trunk, about 3 years of falling in love with a mind, with a soul, with the only person who had ever truly seen her. When she finished, Rosalie was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the city bells tolled 9 o'clock. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Do you love him? Rosalie asked finally. Yes. The word came out, raw, honest. Yes, I love him. Rosalie stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gas lamps flickering on Louisburg Square. When she turned back, her face was set with a determination Thea had never seen before. Then we have a problem, Rosalie said, because I'm in love with someone too. Thea stared at her sister. What? His name is Captain Augustus Sterling. I met him 3 years ago at a naval reception. He's the second son of a baronet, respectable, honorable, but no title, no great fortune. When father discovered we were corresponding, he forbade it. Augustus was ordered to the Philippines. I haven't seen him in 30 months. Rosalie's voice cracked on the last words. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. I've been dying, Thea, she whispered. Slowly, every ball, every suitor, every smile I paste on my face, it's killing me. And now father wants me to marry this duke, this stranger, to save us from ruin. And I'll do it, because that's what dutiful daughters do. But I'll be dead inside. Completely dead. Thea crossed the room and took her sister's hands. They had never been particularly close, too different, too separated by the roles assigned to them from birth. But in this moment, they were simply two women trapped in cages they hadn't built. There has to be another way, Thea said. Rosalie laughed, bitter and broken. What other way? We have no money, no prospects. Father has bet everything on me charming this duke. And I'll try. I'll wear the most beautiful dress. I'll smile and flirt and be everything he expects. But Thea, she gripping Thea's hands tighter. What if he sees through it? What if he looks at me and sees what I am, an empty, pretty shell and performing a role? An idea was forming in Thea's mind. Dangerous, reckless, completely mad. What if, Thea said slowly, you didn't try to be what he expects? What if you did the opposite? Rosalie frowned. I don't understand. You said you're dying from pretending, from being the perfect object. What if you stopped? What if you showed him the truth that you're already in love with someone else, that you're being forced into this? Father would kill me, and it wouldn't matter. The Duke is coming for a wife, and I'm the elder daughter. I'm the one who... He's not coming for a wife, Thea interrupted. He's coming for business. Shipping routes. That's what his letter said. The marriage scheme is father's idea, not his. Rosalie's eyes widened. You think he doesn't know? I think, Thea said carefully, that Harrison Whitmore is one of the most honorable men I've ever encountered, even in letters. If he knew father was planning to auction you off to pay debts, he would be appalled. He believes in women's rational autonomy. He thinks treating women as commodities is morally unconscionable. Then what do we do? Thea took a deep breath. The idea that had been forming crystallized into certainty. Terrifying, exhilarating certainty. We test him, Thea said. We show him the truth. If he's the man I believe he is, the man he's been in those letters, he'll respect honesty over performance. He'll see through father's scheme and refuse to participate. But what if you're wrong? What if he wants exactly what every other man wants? Beauty compliance, a decorative wife. Then, Thea said, feeling something hard and bright settle in her chest, we'll know he's not worth having, either of us. Rosalie studied her sister's face for a long moment. Then slowly she smiled. It was not her society smile, bright and empty. It was real. What do you need me to do? She asked. I need you, Thea said, to help me make a statement. She walked to her wardrobe and pulled out the gray wool dress, the one she'd worn to Harrison's lecture 3 years ago. The plainest, most unfashionable thing she owned. 5 years old, severely cut the color of smoke and shadow. I need you to help me look as invisible as possible, Thea said. No jewelry, no elaborate hair, nothing that screams marriage prospect. If Harrison remembers me, really remembers me, it won't matter what I'm wearing. And if he doesn't, she swallowed hard. If he doesn't, then I was never real to him anyway. Rosalie took the dress, turning it over in her hands. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You're going to test whether he sees you, she said. Really sees you. Yes, and if he does, if he chooses you over me, Thea met her sister's eyes, then I'll fight for him, and you'll be free to wait for Augustus. Father will never allow it. Father, Thea said, doesn't get to decide anymore. Not for me, and if I can help it, not for you either. They stood in the lamplight, these two sisters who had been pitted against each other their entire lives by a society that valued only surfaces. And for the first time, they chose alliance. 4 days, Rosalie said. We have 4 days to prepare. 4 days, Thea agreed. That night, after Rosalie left, Thea pulled out the bundle of letters from their hiding place. 23 pieces of paper covered in Harrison's precise handwriting. 23 proofs that she had not imagined the connection between them. That for 3 years, two minds had met across an ocean and built something real. She unfolded the most recent letter dated 3 months ago. In it, Harrison had written about his latest essay on educational reform, but he had also included something more personal. I find myself wondering, Miss Ashford, what you are reading at this moment, what arguments you are constructing, what injustices you are preparing to dismantle with that formidable intellect of yours. Cambridge feels very far from Boston. Sometimes I think the real tragedy of distance is not the miles, but the conversations left unheld, the ideas left unshared. I hope you know that every essay I write is in some sense a letter to you, an attempt to continue what we began in that lecture hall, an attempt to remain worthy of your remarkable mind. Thea pressed the letter to her chest, eyes closed. In 4 days, Harrison Whitmore would walk through their door. He would see Rosalie in silk and diamonds. He would see Thea in gray wool, deliberately invisible. And then they would know. They would finally know if 3 years of letters had been real or just a beautiful fiction she had told herself to survive the suffocating reality of her life. She refolded the letter carefully and returned it to its hiding place. Then she sat down at her writing desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. She did not write to Harrison. That would be improper, desperate. Instead, she wrote to herself, "A promise I will not hide who I am. Not anymore. If he wants perfection, he can have Rosalie. But if he wants truth, if he wants a mind that challenges him, a partner who sees him as clearly as he sees her, then I will fight for that. Even if it means defying father. Even if it means society's scorn. Even if it terrifies me. I am done being invisible." She signed it, dated it, and sealed it in an envelope. Then she placed it in the drawer of her desk where it would wait with her for the arrival of Harrison Whitmore and whatever came after. Outside her window, September rain began to fall, washing the city clean for whatever was coming. 4 days. The carriage arrived precisely at 6 o'clock on the evening of October 2nd, 1899. Thea watched from the library window as it rolled to a stop before their townhouse, a magnificent black brougham pulled by matched grays, the ducal crest gleaming gold on the door. Boston's autumn dusk was settling over Beacon Hill, gas lamps flickering to life along the street, their glow turning the wet cobblestones into rivers of amber. Her heart hammered against her ribs like something trying to escape. She had spent 4 days preparing for this moment. 4 days of helping her mother frantically ready the house, polishing silver that hadn't been used in months, arranging flowers in vases they'd had to borrow from neighbors who didn't yet know the Ashfords were on the brink of ruin. 4 days of watching Rosalie stand for endless fittings, being draped in silks and satins, like a doll being dressed for display. 4 days of her father's increasingly desperate instructions about how they must all behave, what they must say, how everything depended on making the right impression. And Thea had spent those 4 days wearing her simplest dresses to dinner, reading philosophy in corners, practicing invisibility, preparing herself for the possibility that Harrison Whitmore might walk through their door and not recognize her at all. Now the moment was here. She smoothed down the gray wool dress one final time. It hung on her frame like a sack, deliberately shapeless, the color of ash and shadow. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. No curls, no ribbons, no ornamentation. No jewelry except her mother's old silver locket, tarnished and plain. She looked like a governess, a companion, someone designed to fade into wallpaper. If Harrison saw her anyway, if he looked past all of this and still knew her, then it was real. If he didn't, then she would know the truth, that the connection she'd felt through 23 letters had been one-sided, a fantasy, a desperate woman reading meaning into professional courtesy. "Thea!" Her mother's voice, shrill with nerves, called from downstairs. "He's here. Come down immediately." Thea took one last look at her reflection in the darkened window glass. A ghost stared back at her, a shadow of a woman, exactly what she had spent 22 years being. She descended the stairs. The foyer blazed with light. Every lamp and candelabra in the house had been pressed into service, turning the entrance hall into something almost theatrical. Her father stood near the door in his best evening clothes, looking 10 years older than he had a week ago. Her mother fidgeted with her pearls, her smile bright and desperate. And Rosalie stood in the center of the foyer like a vision from a painting. She wore a gown of emerald silk that brought out the gold in her hair and made her skin glow like porcelain. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, borrowed Thea knew from Mrs. Gardner next door, but no one would guess that from looking. She was breathtaking. Perfect. Everything a duke could possibly want. And she looked miserable beneath the smile. Their eyes met across the foyer. Rosalie's expression flickered, worry, solidarity, fear. Then the mask slipped back into place as the door opened. The butler stepped aside, and Harrison Whitmore walked into the Ashford house like a storm-given human form. He was taller than Thea remembered, broader in the shoulders. The silver at his temples had spread, threading through the dark hair, making him look distinguished rather than old. He wore evening clothes with the ease of someone born to them, but there was nothing soft about him. His face was harder than she remembered, carved with lines that spoke of grief and time and things endured. His eyes were the same, though dark, intelligent, capable of seeing through comfortable lies. Those eyes swept the room, past her father's obsequious bow, past her mother's fluttering welcome. They found Rosalie lingered there for a moment, appreciation without warmth, and then continued moving. They found Thea standing halfway up the staircase in her gray wool dress, and stopped. Everything stopped. Harrison Whitmore's expression transformed. Surprise gave way to recognition, gave way to something that looked almost like pain. His lips parted. For a moment, he seemed to forget where he was, who was watching. For a moment, there was only Thea in her worst dress and Harrison staring at her like a man who had finally found something he'd been searching for. "Miss Ashford," he said, not to Rosalie, to her. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Cultured English, with an underlying warmth that his formal words couldn't quite hide. "You're wearing gray wool," he continued, and Thea's breath caught because she heard it. She heard the recognition, the memory. "Just like you did at Harvard." The foyer went very quiet. Her father's face cycled through confusion, alarm, and something approaching horror. Her mother's mouth opened and closed silently. Rosalie's eyes widened, but Thea saw the corner of her sister's mouth twitch upward. Harrison crossed the foyer in 3 long strides, ignoring Rosalie's extended hand. Her perfect curtsy, everything their father had orchestrated. He stopped at the base of the stairs and looked up at Thea like she was the only person in the room. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years, and I remember every word we spoke for 2 hours. Do you? Thea gripped the banister, afraid her legs might give out. Yes, she whispered. Every word. Then I have a question that I've wanted to ask for 3 years. Harrison's eyes held hers, intense, unwavering. Did you mean it? What you said about Wollstonecraft, that denying women rational capacity wasn't protection, but imprisonment. Did you mean it, or were you merely testing me? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with 3 years of letters, 3 years of intellectual communion across an ocean, 3 years of wondering. I meant it, Thea said, her voice growing stronger. Every word. I've thought of little else for 3 years. I've read everything you've published. I've written responses I never sent because... She stopped. Because saying more would be admitting too much. Because her father was watching with dawning comprehension and growing fury. Because this was not how it was supposed to happen. But Harrison smiled, not the polite smile he'd given Rosalie. A real smile, one that reached his eyes and transformed his severe face into something beautiful. Because convention says a young lady shouldn't initiate philosophical correspondence with a gentleman, he finished for her. How thoroughly Wollstonecraft would disapprove of such restrictions. Your Grace, Marcus Ashford interrupted, his voice tight with forced joviality. Perhaps we should move to the drawing room. Dinner will be served soon, and I'm sure you'd like to. In a moment, Mr. Ashford. Harrison didn't take his eyes off Thea. I find I'm not quite finished with this conversation. He ascended 2 steps, closing the distance between them. Close enough now that Thea could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight imperfection where an old scar marked his left eyebrow. Close enough that she could smell cedar and ink and something uniquely him. I came back for you, he said so quietly only she could hear. The shipping routes were an excuse, a way to see you again without causing scandal. I told myself I needed to know if what I felt during those 2 hours was real or just, Your Grace, really, we must insist, her father tried again. Mr. Ashford, Harrison said, his voice acquiring an edge of steel. I will join you momentarily, but first I will finish speaking with your daughter, this daughter. The emphasis was deliberate, unmistakable. Thea watched her father's face turn red, then pale. Watched her mother press a hand to her mouth. Watched Rosalie's smile grow genuine for the first time in days. The library, Thea heard herself say. If you'd like to continue this discussion, Your Grace, my father has an adequate library. I would like nothing better, Miss Ashford. Harrison offered his arm. Thea descended the remaining stairs and took it, feeling the solid warmth of him through the layers of wool and linen. Together they walked past her stunned family toward the library doors. Theodora? Her father's voice cracked like a whip. This is completely inappropriate. His Grace is here to discuss philosophy. Apparently, Rosalie interjected sweetly, stepping between her father and the library. Do give them a moment, Father. I'm sure His Grace knows what he wants. Thea met her sister's eyes. Thank you, she mouthed. Rosalie winked. Then Thea and Harrison were through the doors, and the library wrapped around them like a sanctuary. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The library was Thea's refuge, her true home, and having Harrison here felt like 2 parts of her life colliding in impossible ways. He released her arm and moved to the shelves, running his fingers along the spines with the reverence of someone who understood what books meant. Your father's collection is smaller than I expected, he said finally. Most of it was sold last year. Thea replied, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. The railroad speculation, the debts. We've been selling everything we can to forestall. She stopped, mortified. This was not how you spoke to a duke. This was not how you secured a marriage proposal for your sister. But Harrison turned from the books, and his expression was knowing. Sad. I know, he said gently. Thea's world tilted. What? About the debts, about your father's financial situation, about the fact that I was invited here tonight, not primarily for shipping discussions, but because your family is desperate. He moved closer, his voice softening. Thea, may I call you Thea? I make it my business to investigate thoroughly before entering any arrangement. I knew before I stepped off the ship exactly how dire things are for the Ashford family. Shame burned in Thea's chest, hot and acidic. Then you know why Rosalie was dressed like a princess. Why my father was so eager to... Her voice broke. We're trying to sell her to you, to save ourselves from ruin. Yes, Harrison said simply. I know. And you came anyway. Anger was rising now, mixing with the shame. What kind of man knowingly walks into a trap like that? Were you curious to see how desperate we'd become? Did you want to... I came, Harrison interrupted, his voice firm, because I received your father's letter the same week I'd finished writing my own. A letter to you, Thea, the 24th in a correspondence that has been the brightest part of my life for 3 years. A letter in which I was trying to find the courage to ask if I might call on you, if there was any possibility that what I'd felt during our conversation might be reciprocated. Thea stared at him. You were writing to me. I've been writing to you for 3 years. Every letter I sent, every essay I published, they were all attempts to stay connected to you, to prove I was still worthy of that extraordinary mind I encountered for 2 hours. Harrison's hands clenched at his sides. When your father's letter arrived, I saw an opportunity, a way to return to Boston, to see you without forcing you into an impossible social situation. If I came for business, there would be no expectations, no pressure, just a chance to discover if what we'd built through letters was real. But your father's schemes are his own, Harrison said. I have no intention of being manipulated into a marriage with anyone, however beautiful. But Thea, I also have no intention of leaving Boston without telling you the truth. He took a breath and she saw his hands trembling slightly. I have thought of you every day for 3 years. I returned to England after our conversation and tried to forget you. You were 19, I was 30. I told myself it was impossible and inappropriate. So I buried myself in work, in my estates, in everything I could find to distract me from the memory of 2 hours that changed my life. It didn't work, Thea whispered. No, Harrison's laugh was rough, broken. It didn't work. Every book I read, I wondered what you would think of it. Every political debate, I imagined your counter-arguments. When my mother pressed me to marry to move on from Eleanor's death, I found myself measuring every woman against you, against a woman I'd spoken to for 2 hours. It was madness. I did the same, Thea confessed. Every suitor my parents paraded before me, and there weren't many. I'm not exactly a desirable prospect. I compared them to you, to someone I barely knew, to someone who might not even remember me. Oh, I remembered. Harrison moved closer still until only a foot of space separated them. I remembered the way you argued, the fire in your eyes when you defended Wollstonecraft. I remembered thinking that if rational souls could recognize each other, mine had found its match. And then I left like a coward because I didn't know how to navigate the social machinery that would keep us apart. Your Grace. Harrison, he interrupted. Please. After 3 years of letters, after what we've been to each other, at least in writing, I think you can call me Harrison. Harrison. Thea repeated the name strange and wonderful on her tongue. Why are you telling me this? If you know about the debts, if you know my father is trying to force a marriage with Rosalie, why are you standing here with me? Because, Harrison said, his voice dropping to something raw and honest, I spent 8 years in a tomb of grief after my wife died. 8 years of numbness, of going through the motions of life without truly living. And then I met you, and for 2 hours I felt alive again. When your father's letter arrived, I knew there was a trap. I knew what he wanted, but I also knew that if I didn't come back, if I didn't find out if you felt even a fraction of what I felt, I would spend the rest of my life wondering. Thea's eyes burned with unshed tears. I wore this dress deliberately, she said. The worst thing I own. I wanted to test you, to see if you would look past Rosalie, past the performance my father orchestrated, and see me, really see me. And if you didn't, I would know that everything I'd felt for 3 years was just a fantasy I'd built from letters. And now, Harrison's hand lifted, hovering near her face, not quite touching. What do you know now? Now, Thea said, I'm terrified, because this is real. You're real, and I don't know what to do with that. Then let me tell you what I'm going to do. Harrison's voice was steady now, certain. Tomorrow I'm going to speak with your father. I'm going to make it very clear that I will not be coerced into marrying anyone. But I'm also going to offer to settle his debts completely with no strings attached. Thea jerked back. What? Why would you? Because desperate fathers shouldn't have to auction their daughters to save themselves, Harrison said fiercely. Because the system that puts women in this position is morally repugnant, and I will not participate in it. Your father's debts are not your burden to carry, Thea. Not yours, not Rosalie's. I have the means to help, so I will. But then, Thea's mind raced. If you settle the debts, my father will have no leverage. He'll have no reason to force Rosalie to marry you. Which means, Harrison said, and now he did touch her, his fingers gentle against her cheek, that if I ask to court you, if I ask you to consider me as a suitor, it will be entirely your choice. No debts, no obligations, no pressure. Just you and me and the question of whether what we found in letters can become something more in life. Thea closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. My father will be furious. Society will be scandalized. I'm the younger daughter, the plain one, the one who's supposed to disappear. If you choose me over Rosalie, I'm not choosing you over Rosalie, Harrison interrupted gently. I'm choosing you because you're you, because your mind sets mine on fire. Because in 3 years of searching, I've never found another soul that understands mine the way yours does. Your sister is lovely, but Thea, when I look at her, I feel nothing but a distant sort of aesthetic appreciation. When I look at you, I feel alive. A knock at the library door shattered the moment. Marcus Ashford's voice tight with barely controlled fury. Your Grace, dinner is served. If you would be so kind as to join us. Harrison stepped back, but his eyes never left Thea's face. We should go, he said quietly, before your father has an apoplexy. But Thea, this conversation isn't finished. Not by a long way. No, Thea agreed, her heart still racing. It's not finished. They returned to the foyer together. Marcus Ashford's face was a study in suppressed rage. Margaret Ashford looked near tears, but Rosalie was smiling genuine and warm as she took Thea's hand and squeezed it. Shall we go in to dinner? Rosalie said brightly. I'm sure His Grace has much to discuss with all of us. And so they proceeded to what would become the longest, strangest dinner of Thea's life. The dining room had been prepared for seduction. Candles everywhere, their light soft and flattering. The best china polished until it gleamed. Flowers arranged with desperate care. The table set for 6, the 4 Ashfords, Harrison and Mr. Charles Whitmore, Harrison's business associate, who had arrived with him and sat now at the far end, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Marcus Ashford had orchestrated the seating with transparent intent. Rosalie, to Harrison's right, positioned to showcase her beauty in the candlelight. Thea had been relegated to the far end of the table near Mr. Whitmore, where she could be safely ignored. It didn't work out that way. The first course was served oysters on ice, a delicacy they could barely afford. Marcus launched into a prepared speech about Boston's shipping advantages, clearly trying to steer the conversation toward business that would then pivot to marriage settlements. Harrison listened politely, made appropriate sounds of interest, and then turned to Thea. Miss Thea, he said, his voice carrying down the length of the table. I've been meaning to ask your opinion. I've just read John Stuart Mill's new essay on representative government. What did you think of his treatment of minority representation? The table went silent. Rosalie bit her lip to hide a smile. Marcus Ashford's fork clattered against his plate. I haven't had the pleasure of reading it, Your Grace, Margaret Ashford interjected quickly. But Rosalie has been studying French poetry, and her watercolors are really quite... I asked Miss Thea, Harrison said, his tone polite but implacable. All eyes turned to Thea. She could feel her father's glare, her mother's panic. This was not how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to be invisible. But Harrison was looking at her with that same intensity he'd had in the library, waiting for her answer with genuine interest. And Thea realized she had a choice. She could play the role expected of her, demure, silent, forgettable. Or she could be honest. She chose honesty. I thought, Thea said, her voice steady, that Mill's arguments were brilliant in theory, but weak on implementation. He underestimates how entrenched power structures resist reform. His faith in rational discourse assumes all participants are operating in good faith, which history repeatedly proves is not the case. Harrison's eyes lit up. Exactly. That's precisely you saw that too. The gap between philosophical ideal and political reality. It's Mill's consistent blind spot, Thea said, warming to the subject, forgetting the awkwardness of the table. He assumes that if you present truth clearly enough, people will accept it. But power doesn't surrender to truth. It surrenders to force or self-interest, and Mill refuses to acknowledge that. Though one could argue, Harrison countered, leaning forward, that Mill is attempting to chart a path between revolution and stagnation. He knows violent overthrow rarely improves things, but he also can't accept static injustice. So he proposes rational reform even knowing it's imperfect. But rational reform requires willing reformers, Thea argued. What do you do when those in power profit from injustice? When appealing to their reason means asking them to voluntarily relinquish advantage, Mill has no answer for that. Kant might, Harrison said. The categorical imperative assumes universal reason, which is the same error in different clothing. Thea interrupted, then flushed. Forgive me, I didn't mean to. Don't apologize. Harrison's smile was radiant. This is the first genuine philosophical debate I've had in months. Please continue. What would you propose instead of Mill's approach? And they were off, racing through ideas like runners on a track. The table faded away. The oysters sat forgotten on their plates. For 45 minutes, Thea and Harrison argued philosophy, building on each other's points, challenging assumptions, pushing back against conventional wisdom. They quoted Locke and Rousseau from memory. They disagreed about Kant's practical applications. They found surprising common ground on the limitations of social contract theory. It was exactly like their first conversation 3 years ago, but deeper. Now richer, informed by 3 years of letters and separate reading and thinking. It was intellectual communion of a kind Thea had never experienced with anyone else. It was, she realized with a shock, the most profound connection she'd ever felt. This meeting of minds, this perfect matching of thought and counter-thought. Finally, Marcus Ashford could take it no more. Your Grace, he said, loudly, cutting across Thea's point about American versus British constitutionalism. Forgive me, but we've monopolized your time with dull political theory. Surely you'd prefer to hear Rosalie play the pianoforte. Her Chopin is quite accomplished. Harrison turned to look at Marcus Ashford as if seeing him for the first time. His expression was cool, polite, and absolutely unyielding. Mr. Ashford, he said quietly, I have spent the last several months attending dinner parties where accomplished young ladies played Chopin and discussed the weather and demonstrated every possible social grace. It was crushingly boring. Your daughter Thea, on the other hand, has just articulated a criticism of Mill that I've been struggling to formulate for weeks. I find I'm far more interested in her theories on constitutional reform than in anyone's Chopin, however accomplished. The silence that followed was arctic. Rosalie Blesser laughed a genuine, delighted sound. Well, Father, I did tell you Thea was the clever one. Perhaps His Grace prefers intelligence to embroidery. That's quite enough, Rosalie, Margaret Ashford said sharply, but Harrison was already standing. Mr. Ashford, might I have a word with you in private? There are some business matters we should discuss before the evening grows too late. Marcus Ashford rose, his face a mask of confusion and dread. The two men exited toward the study, leaving the women at the table. The moment the door closed, Margaret Ashford turned on Thea. What were you thinking, she hissed, monopolizing His Grace's attention like that, showing off your learning as if… Mother. Rosalie's voice was quiet but firm. Stop. Can't you see he's not interested in me? He's interested in Thea. He has been from the moment he walked through the door. That's absurd, Margaret sputtered. You're the beauty. You're the one who's been dying inside for 3 years, Rosalie interrupted. Mother, I don't want to marry the Duke. I never did. And thank God, because he clearly doesn't want to marry me either. Thea reached for her sister's hand under the table. Rosalie squeezed back, and for a moment they were united. In the study, voices rose, Marcus Ashford's incredulous, Harrison's calm and implacable. Thea couldn't make out words, but she could hear the tone. Negotiation, refusal, something being offered and refused and offered again. Finally, the door opened. The men returned. Marcus Ashford looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, pale, shaking, utterly bewildered. Harrison's face was serene. Ladies, Harrison said, addressing them all but looking at Thea, I thank you for a fascinating evening. Mr. Ashford and I have concluded our business discussions. I will call again tomorrow at 2 o'clock if that's agreeable. I would very much like to continue our conversation, Miss Thea. Perhaps a walk in the public garden, properly chaperoned, of course. Ah, yes, Thea managed. That would be acceptable. Excellent. Harrison bowed formally to each of them in turn, but when he straightened from bowing to Thea, he held her eyes for a moment longer. In them, she saw promise, and something that looked very much like hope. Then he was gone, mister. Whitmore trailing after him, leaving the Ashford family in stunned silence. Marcus Ashford sank into his chair, staring at nothing. What happened? Margaret demanded. What did he say? Her husband laughed a broken, bitter sound. He's arranged to settle our debts, all of them. $470,000 to be transferred to our creditors within the week. The bank draft arrives in the morning, no strings, no conditions. And then he told me that he would be courting Thea. Not Rosalie, Thea, and that I was not to interfere. The room spun. Thea gripped the edge of the table trying to process what she just heard. But that's impossible, Margaret whispered. Why would he? Because apparently, Marcus said, his voice hollow, our younger daughter possesses a mind extraordinary enough to capture a duke's genuine interest. And I never noticed. God help us all, I spent 22 years looking right through her. Rosalie stood and crossed to Thea, pulling her into an embrace. He saw you, she whispered. Just like you hoped. He really saw you. Thea buried her face in her sister's shoulder and let the tears come, tears of relief, of terror, of 3 years of longing, finally impossibly finding their answer. In the morning, Harrison Whitmore would return, and Thea's life would change forever. But tonight, in her sister's arms, surrounded by her family's bewilderment and the impossible gift of freedom, Thea allowed herself to feel something she'd barely dared hope for in 3 long years. Joy. Pure, terrifying, exhilarating joy. The morning after Harrison's dinner visit, Thea woke to find her father standing at the foot of her bed. The early October light slanted through her window, turning the dust motes to gold, and for a moment she thought she was dreaming. Marcus Ashford had not entered her bedroom since she was a child. Father, she sat up, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. What's wrong? He looked older in the morning light. The lines around his eyes had deepened overnight, carved by shame or relief, or some combination of emotions he didn't have words for. He held a piece of paper in his hands, turning it over and over with trembling fingers. The Duke's bank draft arrived an hour ago, he said quietly. $470,000. He wasn't bluffing. By week's end, we'll be free of debt. The house, the business, everything saved. Thea waited. There had to be more. Men like her father didn't visit their disappointing daughters at dawn to deliver good news. He's coming back today, Marcus continued, at 2 o'clock. He asked permission to call on you, formally, with the intention of courtship. He finally looked at her directly. I don't understand you, Theodora. I never have. You were always buried in books, always asking questions that made my head ache. I thought you were difficult, unmarriageable, a problem to be managed. I know, Thea said. The words didn't hurt as much as they once would have, perhaps because for the first time they didn't feel like the final verdict on her worth. The Duke spent 45 minutes last night talking to you about philosophy. Not to Rosalie about music or poetry or any of the accomplishments we spent thousands of dollars training her in. To you, about political theory. Marcus shook his head in bewilderment. He said you have one of the most remarkable minds he's encountered anywhere. And then he handed me a bank draft that will save us from ruin and told me in no uncertain terms that he would court you whether I approved or not. So you're here to forbid it? Thea asked, her heart sinking. No, the word came out rough. I'm here to apologize. I've been blind, Theodora. For 22 years, I've been looking at you and seeing only what you weren't. Not beautiful like your sister, not biddable, not easy. I never saw what you were, what you are. And I very nearly destroyed your chance at happiness because of it. Tears pricked at Thea's eyes. Father, let me finish. Marcus held up a hand. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even know how to make amends for 2 decades of dismissal. But I'm telling you now, if you want to accept the Duke's courtship, you have my blessing. And if he's fool enough to propose to a woman who will argue philosophy with him over breakfast for the rest of his life, then God help him, because he'll have chosen a wife who will never let him rest on comfortable assumptions. He almost smiled when he said it. Almost. Thank you, Thea whispered. Marcus nodded, once awkward and uncertain, and left. But something had shifted in the room and the air between them. Not redemption, not yet, but a beginning. 2 hours later, Rosalie swept into Thea's room carrying an armful of dresses. Absolutely not, she said, eyeing the gray wool Thea had laid out on the bed. You've made your point. He saw you in your worst. Now let him see you in something that doesn't look like a governess's hand-me-down. Rosalie, I don't want him to think. That you own more than one dress, that you occasionally acknowledge you have a figure. Rosalie tossed a gown of soft blue wool under the bed. This one, it's simple, it's dignified, and it doesn't make you look like you're in mourning for your own life. Besides, the color brings out your eyes. Thea touched the dress. It was beautiful in its simplicity, well cut and elegant, without being ostentatious. When did you even have this made? Last year. I ordered it for you and hid it because I knew you'd refuse to wear it. Rosalie sat on the bed, her expression turning serious. Thea, listen to me. You don't have to hide anymore. You tested him with the gray wool and he passed. He saw you. Now let him see all of you, including the part that knows she deserves beautiful things. I'm terrified, Thea admitted. What if this is a dream? What if I wake up and then at least you'll have lived the dream fully instead of hiding from it? Rosalie took her hands. Captain Augustus wrote to me this morning. He's returning from the Philippines next month. The Duke somehow got word to him, arranged for his early transfer. He's giving me back my love, Thea. The least you can do is let him court you without sabotaging yourself. Thea laughed despite her fear. When did you become so wise? When I spent 3 years dying inside while looking perfect on the outside. I learned what matters and what doesn't. Rosalie stood, pulling Thea up with her. Now let's make you beautiful. Not for him, for you. Harrison arrived at precisely 2 o'clock in a carriage that drew stares from everyone on Louisburg Square. He wore a perfectly tailored suit of charcoal gray, and when the butler showed him into the drawing room, his eyes went immediately to Thea. She saw the moment he registered the blue dress, the way her hair had been arranged by Rosalie's skilled hands, still simple but softer, more becoming. His expression transformed into something between appreciation and relief. Miss Ashford, he said, bowing. You look lovely. Different from last night, Thea said. Austin. No, Harrison's voice was quiet and tense. You look like yourself, both the woman who wore gray wool to test me and the woman who knows she deserves to be seen. I'm honored to witness both. Marcus Ashford cleared his throat from his position by the fireplace. Your grace about our conversation last night is settled, Mr. Ashford, Harrison interrupted politely but firmly. As I said, the debt settlement is unconditional. What happens between myself and your daughter is a separate matter entirely. Now, if you'll permit me, I'd like to take Miss Thea for a walk in the public garden. With Miss Rosalie as chaperone, of course. It wasn't really a request, and they all knew it. Within 10 minutes, the three of them were walking down Commonwealth Avenue toward the public garden, Rosalie trailing at a discreet distance that gave the illusion of propriety while allowing Harrison and Thea to speak privately. 4 days, Harrison said as they entered the park. The October afternoon was crisp and golden leaves falling around them like benedictions. I'm giving your father 4 days. On the 5th day, I'm going to ask you to marry me. Thea stopped walking. That's Harrison, that's madness. People court for months, sometimes years. I've already courted you for 3 years through letters, Harrison interrupted. I know your mind, Thea. I know how you think, what you value, what makes you angry, and what brings you joy. I know you well enough to know that I want to spend the rest of my life knowing you better. But I also know that your father's creditors are circling, that society is watching, that every day of uncertainty is a day you'll spend afraid. This is temporary, so I'm telling you now, I'm going to propose in 4 days. And I very much hope you'll say yes. But what if we're wrong? Thea's voice shook. What if 3 years of letters built something that can't survive actual proximity? What if I disappoint you? Then we'll have 4 days to find out, Harrison said. 4 days of honesty, Thea. No performance, no pretense. Just you and me discovering if what we found in writing translates to life. Will you give me that 4 days to court you properly? Thea looked up at him, at this man who had crossed an ocean on the mere possibility that what they'd found in 2 hours might be real. At the man who had settled her father's debts with no strings attached because he believed desperate fathers shouldn't have to sell their daughters. At the man who looked at her in her worst dress and saw something extraordinary. 4 days, she agreed. But Harrison, I need you to understand something. I'm not easy. I'm argumentative and stubborn, and I care more about ideas than social graces. I'll embarrass you at dinner parties by debating politics with men who think women shouldn't have opinions. I'll fill our house with books instead of decorations. You'll be exactly who you are, Harrison interrupted, taking her hand. It was improper, scandalous, even with Rosalie watching. Thea didn't care. And I'll spend the rest of my life grateful that you chose me instead of someone who wanted you to be anything other than yourself. Now, shall we walk? I want to hear your thoughts on Rousseau's social contract. I've been disagreeing with your position for 3 years, and I'd very much like to do so in person. Thea laughed and they walked deeper into the garden arguing philosophy, while Rosalie hummed contentedly behind them, and Boston's autumn painted the world in gold. The first day unfolded like a gift Thea had never dared ask for. They walked for 2 hours, and when Harrison's arguments about natural rights ran up against Thea's practical objections about power structures, the debate grew so heated that several passing couples stopped to stare. Rosalie intervened before anyone could complain, steering them to a quieter path where they could argue in peace. "You're both terrifying," Rosalie said cheerfully when they finally paused for breath. "Captain Augustus and I discussed naval tactics and poetry. You two debate whether government can ever be truly legitimate. I don't know whether to be impressed or concerned for your future children's dinner table conversations." Harrison and Thea looked at each other and laughed, and the ease of it, this simple joy of finding someone who matched your mind and wasn't afraid of conflict, settled into Thea's bones like coming home. That evening, Harrison sent a note requesting permission to call again the next day. It arrived with a book, a first edition of Wollstonecraft's Vindication, inscribed on the flyleaf in Harrison's precise hand, for Thea, who understood this before I did. "May we spend our lives defending these truths together." Thea pressed the book to her chest and allowed herself to believe just a little that this might be real. The second day, Harrison invited the Ashford family to his rented townhouse on Mount Vernon Street. The house was elegant, but not ostentatious, filled with the kind of quiet good taste that spoke of wealth deployed thoughtfully. But it was the library that made Thea's breath catch. 12,000 volumes. Floor-to-ceiling shelves in a room that stretched the entire length of the second floor. Philosophy, political theory, history, science, literature. Every subject imaginable cataloged and cared for with reverence. Light poured through tall windows and comfortable chairs were scattered throughout like invitations to stay, to read, to think. "It's beautiful," Thea whispered. "It's yours," Harrison said quietly, pressing something into her hand. "A key. Whenever you want. For as long as you want. This is what I can offer you, Thea, not just marriage, but partnership. Use this library. Fill it with your own books. Write your own essays. This space is as much yours as mine if you'll have it." Thea stared at the key, then at Harrison's face. He meant it. She could see it in his eyes. This wasn't a pretty offer designed to seduce. It was a genuine invitation to claim space, to be herself, to build something together. "There's something you should know," Harrison said, leading her to a quieter corner while her family examined the rest of the house. "About Eleanor, my first wife." Thea had been waiting for this. "You don't have to." "I do." Harrison's face tightened with old pain. "She died 8 years ago in childbirth. The baby too, a son. I blamed myself for years. Better doctors, different decisions, something I should have seen or done or prevented. I locked myself away after that. Managed my estates, fulfilled my obligations, but I was numb, dead inside in all the ways that mattered." He took Thea's hands, his grip almost desperate. "When I met you at Harvard, something woke up. I felt alive for the first time in 8 years, and it terrified me, Thea. You were so young and I was so damaged, and I convinced myself it was temporary. Infatuation born of intellectual excitement, nothing more. So I left. I went back to England and tried to forget you. I almost succeeded." "What changed?" Thea asked softly. "The letters. Every letter you wrote showed me someone real, not a fantasy. Someone brilliant and honest and unafraid to challenge me. I realized I was falling in love, not with a memory, but with a person. And I had to come back. I had to know if you felt even a fraction of what I felt, or if I'd been building something in my head that didn't exist." "I felt it," Thea said. "Every letter, every word. For 3 years, you were the brightest part of my life. But Harrison, I'm not Eleanor. I can't replace what you lost." "I don't want you to replace her." Harrison's voice was fierce. "Eleanor was brilliant in her own way, passionate about social reform, full of fire. I loved her, and I'll always grieve her. But you're not a replacement, Thea. You're something entirely new. The woman I fell in love with after learning that loving again was possible. If you'll have me, damaged history, and all I swear, I'll spend every day proving worthy of you." Thea reached up and touched his face, this man who was offering her not just love, but honesty. Not just partnership, but equality. Not just marriage, but intellectual communion. "You already are," she whispered. "And they're surrounded by 12,000 books that would be hers if she chose." Harrison Whitmore kissed her for the first time. It was gentle, reverent, and absolutely devastating in its tenderness. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Thea saw tears in Harrison's eyes. "2 more days," he said roughly. 2 more days, and I'm asking you properly. I hope to God you say yes, because, Thea, I don't think I can go back to numbness after this." "Then don't," Thea said. Don't go back. Stay here with me. They stood in the library holding each other, while downstairs Marcus Ashford examined the house where his daughter might live and began slowly to understand what he'd almost destroyed through blindness. The third day brought society's judgment swift and brutal. Mrs. Catherine Gardner was hosting her monthly salon, 50 of Boston's most influential women gathering, in her Beacon Street drawing room to discuss literature and politics, and more honestly to dissect the latest gossip. Thea had been invited because refusing Mrs. Gardner was unthinkable. Harrison had arranged to arrive midway through, ostensibly to pick up Thea and Rosalie, but actually to make their courtship undeniably public. Thea entered the salon in her blue dress, Rosalie resplendent beside her in rose silk. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they shifted, became sharper, more pointed. Women smiled with their mouths while their eyes calculated and measured and found Thea wanting. Miss Ashford, Mrs. Gardner said, her voice carrying across the room. How delightful to see you. We were just discussing the new production of Hamlet at the theater. Are you familiar with Shakespeare? It was a trap. A way to expose Thea's education or lack thereof, as society preferred to assume about women who weren't decorative. Reasonably familiar, Mrs. Gardner, Thea said carefully, though I confess I find the political theory more interesting than the romance. Titters rippled through the room. A woman in an elaborate hat, Mrs. Peyton, whose daughter had been angling for Harrison's attention, smiled coldly. Political theory in Hamlet. My dear, it's a revenge tragedy, not a treatise. It's both, Thea said, feeling the familiar fire kindle in her chest, the same fire that made her argue with Harrison, that made her unable to simply smile and nod. The question of legitimate succession, the role of the state in private morality, whether Claudius's reign can ever be lawful, despite his method of obtaining it, Shakespeare embeds an entire political philosophy in the revenge plot. How scholarly, another woman said, making scholarship sound like a disease. And how unmarriageable, Mrs. Peyton added sweetly. I always tell my daughters men want wives who can discuss the weather pleasantly, not women who pontificate about politics. Then I suppose, Harrison's voice cut through from the doorway, that I must be quite unusual in my preferences. Every head turned. Harrison stood there in impeccable afternoon dress, and when he crossed the room, he came directly to Thea, ignoring the flutter of disappointed mothers and their daughters. Miss Ashford, he said, bowing over her hand, I hope I'm not interrupting. I was hoping you might continue that argument we began yesterday about Hamlet's legitimacy crisis. You made a point about elective versus hereditary monarchy that I've been thinking about all night. The salon went silent. 50 women watched as the Duke of Ashford, one of England's most eligible peers, looked at Theodore Ashford like she'd hung the moon. Your Grace, Mrs. Gardner said, rallying. Surely you'd prefer to discuss more pleasant topics. Miss Peyton was just telling us about her watercolors. I'm sure they're lovely, Harrison said, not looking away from Thea. But I crossed an ocean to find a woman who would rather debate Shakespeare's political philosophy than paint flowers. I seem to have found her. Now, if you'll excuse us, I promise to take Miss Ashford and her sister for a drive through the common. He offered Thea his arm. She took it, feeling the solid strength of him, and together they walked out of that drawing room full of judgment and into the October afternoon. Rosalie followed, barely suppressing her grin. That, she said once they were in the carriage, was magnificent. Did you see Mrs. Peyton's face? I may have destroyed Thea's social standing, Harrison said, concern creeping into his voice. I should have been more diplomatic, less obvious about my preference. You were perfect, Thea interrupted. And I don't care what Mrs. Peyton thinks. Let them whisper. Let them call me unmarriageable and odd and too clever for my own good. I've spent 22 years trying to hide who I am so people would accept me. I'm done hiding. Harrison took her hand, scandalous, with Rosalie watching, but neither of them cared. Tomorrow is the 4th day, he said quietly. Are you ready? I don't know, Thea admitted. Are you? I've been ready since the moment you walked down those stairs in gray wool and refused to apologize for being extraordinary. That night, Thea couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed watching the moon track across her window and thinking about tomorrow, about a proposal that would change everything, about a life built on intellectual partnership and genuine seeing, about terror and hope in equal measure. Around midnight, another knock came at her door, Rosalie again carrying 2 glasses of sherry. Couldn't sleep either, she said, settling onto Thea's bed like they were girls again before the world had divided them into beautiful and plain, valuable and disappointing. Tomorrow, he proposes. Are you going to say yes? I think so, Thea said. I'm terrified, but yes. I think I have to say yes. What if I never find this again? What if I spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough? Then say yes. Rosalie clinked her glass against Thea's. Say yes and be terrified and build something beautiful anyway. And Thea, thank you. For what? For showing me that we don't have to be what they expect. That we can choose our own paths even when those paths are frightening. Rosalie's eyes shone with tears. Augustus will be here in 3 weeks. When the Duke proposes to you tomorrow, I'm going to tell Father that I'm accepting Augustus whether he approves or not. You taught me that. You taught me courage. They sat together in the moonlight, two sisters who had been pitted against each other by a world that valued only certain things and chose instead to be allies, to fight for each other's freedom. Tomorrow, Thea would face her future. Tonight, she had her sister's hand in hers, and 4 days of the most extraordinary courtship in Boston's memory behind her. It would have to be enough. Day 5 dawned cold and crystalline, the kind of October morning that promised winter, but hadn't quite surrendered summer's warmth. Thea dressed carefully in a gown Rosalie had commissioned without telling her deep sapphire wool that brought out the unusual gray blue of her eyes, well cut and elegant, without being ostentatious. It was neither her worst dress nor borrowed finery. It was herself, somewhere between invisible and performing, finally authentically herself. Harrison had sent a note the night before asking permission to call at 11 o'clock. The whole household knew what was coming. Marcus Ashford had been pacing his study since dawn. Margaret hovered in doorways, wringing her hands. Even the servants moved with unusual quietness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When the clock struck 11, Thea was in the drawing room, hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Rosalie sat beside her, providing silent support. Their mother stood by the window, and their father stood blocking the front door. Thea heard the carriage arrive, heard the knock, heard the butler's footsteps. But instead of showing Harrison in, there was a low, intense conversation in the foyer, voices rising, her father's stubborn, desperate. Harrison's calm, but with steel underneath. Then the drawing room door opened, and Marcus Ashford stood there alone, his face set in lines of determination that Thea recognized from every difficult decision of her childhood. I cannot allow this, he said. Thea's world tilted. Father, you said you gave your blessing. I've reconsidered. Marcus stepped into the room, and Thea saw it now, not cruelty but fear. The fear of a man watching his entire understanding of the world collapse. Rosalie is the elder. Society will mock us if the younger daughter marries first. They'll say we couldn't find anyone to take the difficult one, so we foisted her on an unsuspecting duke. Our family name will become a laughingstock. So I should refuse him. Thea's voice shook with fury. Reject the only man who's ever truly seen me because you're worried about gossip. Theodora, you don't understand what you're asking. The scandal. I understand perfectly. Thea stood, her hands clenched at her sides. I understand that you'd rather I be invisible and acceptable than seen and happy. That society's opinion matters more to you than your daughter's chance at a real marriage. I understand that even after everything, you still can't. The drawing room door swung open fully. Harrison stood there, and his face was coldly furious in a way Thea had never seen. Mr. Ashford, he said, his cultured voice sharp as a blade, I arranged to settle your debts 3 days ago. Unconditional. $470,000 transferred to your creditors. The bank draft arrived yesterday morning. Your shipping business is yours again, your house is unencumbered. I did this not as leverage, but because desperate fathers shouldn't have to sell their daughters to survive. Marcus paled. Your Grace, I'm grateful, but I'm not finished. Harrison's eyes could have frozen water. What happens between myself and your daughter is a separate matter entirely. You don't get to trade one form of coercion for another. I didn't buy the right to court Thea. I earned it by seeing who she actually is instead of who you wanted her to be. You don't understand Boston society. I understand perfectly, Harrison interrupted. I understand that you're more concerned with appearances than your daughter's happiness, that you'd rather she marry someone appropriate than someone who loves her. But here's what you need to understand, Mr. Ashford. I am going to ask Thea to marry me, whether you approve or not, whether society approves or not. And her answer is the only one that matters. The silence that followed was absolute. Then footsteps on the stairs. Thea turned to see herself in the mirror, at the landing, not timid, not invisible, but present, fully, completely present. Father, Thea said, her voice clear and steady, I need to tell you something. She walked down the remaining stairs and into the drawing room, positioning herself between Harrison and her father. When she spoke, her voice didn't shake. I have been invisible in this house for 22 years. You didn't notice when I read every book in your library twice. You didn't ask what I thought about anything that mattered. You didn't see me at all because I didn't fit the shape you wanted a daughter to have. I wasn't beautiful like Rosalie. I wasn't biddable. I wasn't easy. Marcus flinched, but Thea continued. Harrison Whitmore saw me in 2 hours. Really saw me. He valued my mind, my thoughts, the parts of me you found so disappointing. For 3 years, he's been my intellectual companion through letters. He challenged me, respected me, treated me like a person instead of a problem to be solved. She turned to look at Harrison, and the love in his eyes gave her courage. I don't need your permission to be loved, Father. I never did. But I want your blessing, because you're still my father, and some part of me still hopes you might learn to see me the way he does. Not as the difficult daughter who ruins your social standing, but as Theodora, as myself. Marcus Ashford's face worked through several emotions, shame, confusion, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in her life. You're right, he said finally, his voice hoarse. About all of it. I've been blind. Not just to you, but to what love actually looks like. I thought I was protecting you by trying to make you acceptable, marriageable, safe. I didn't realize I was suffocating you. He turned to Harrison. Your Grace, I've been unforgivably rude. You've shown my family more generosity than we deserve, and I've repaid it with obstruction. If Theodora chooses you, his voice cracked. If she chooses you, you have my blessing. Both of you do. A sound from the doorway made them all turn. Rosalie stood there, and she wasn't alone. Beside her was a man in naval uniform, sun-bronzed and travel-worn, with eyes that found Rosalie like a compass, finding north. Father, Rosalie said, her voice shaking but determined, this is Captain Augustus Sterling. He returned from the Philippines yesterday, 3 weeks early, thanks to orders arranged by the Duke. I'm in love with him. I have been for 3 years, and I'm going to marry him whether you approve or not. Margaret Ashford made a small bound of distress. Marcus stared at his daughters, both of them standing before him with the men they'd chosen demanding the right to their own lives. For a long moment, the only sound was the clock ticking on the mantel. Then Marcus Ashford began to laugh. Not cruelly, but with the broken, bewildered sound of a man watching his entire world reorganize itself around truths he'd never considered. 2 daughters, he said. 2 brilliant, stubborn, impossible daughters, and I almost destroyed both their chances at happiness because I was too blind to see what was right in front of me. He looked at Harrison, then at Augustus. I don't deserve either of your patience, but if you'll have them, if they'll have you, then God help us all. You have my blessing. Both of you. Harrison crossed the room in 3 strides. He knelt before Thea in front of her entire family, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. 4 days, he said, looking up at her with eyes full of everything they'd built, through letters and conversation, and stubborn refusal to accept the world's narrow definitions. 4 days of courtship to prove what I already knew from 3 years of letters. Theodora Ashford, you are the most extraordinary person I have ever met. You challenge me, inspire me, make me want to be worthy of that remarkable mind. Will you marry me not as ornament or obligation, but as my partner in everything? Thea reached down and pulled him to his feet. Stand up, Harrison. Partners don't kneel to each other. She heard Rosalie's sharp intake of breath, her mother's gasp. But Harrison smiled, that transformative smile that lit his whole face, and stood. Yes, Thea said, taking his hands, feeling the rightness of this moment settle into her bones. Yes, as your intellectual equal, as your collaborator, as your partner. Yes to all of it. Harrison slid the ring onto her finger, a sapphire the exact color of her dress set in delicate gold. Then he kissed her. Proper society be damned, and Thea tasted salt on his lips and realized they were both crying. When they broke apart, the room erupted. Rosalie was embracing Augustus, both of them laughing and crying. Margaret was weeping into her handkerchief, and Marcus stood alone by the fireplace, watching his daughters claim their futures, his face a complicated map of grief and pride and slowly dawning understanding. How long, he asked finally. Until the wedding. Harrison looked at Thea. How long do you need? I've waited 3 years already, Thea said. Why wait longer? Saturday. Saturday? Harrison laughed, delighted. 4 days to court, you 4 days to prepare. Society will be scandalized. Good, Thea said. Let them talk. We'll be too busy arguing philosophy to notice. 4 days later, on a crisp Saturday afternoon in October 1899, Theodora Ashford married Harrison Whitmore in Mrs. Gardner's garden. 50 guests attended, small by Boston standards, but including everyone who mattered. The Duchess of Marlborough sent a letter from England, marry the one who sees you. Everything else is commentary. Thea wore ivory silk, simple and elegant. Harrison wore a morning dress with a blue waistcoat that matched her ring. When the minister asked if anyone objected, the silence was profound. They wrote their own vows. Harrison promised to value her mind as much as her heart, to never ask her to be smaller than she was, to spend his life proving worthy of her trust. Thea promised to challenge him to build something meaningful together, to never hide her light, to make him comfortable. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said. But before Harrison could move, Thea whispered, "Ready to scandalize society together, partner." Harrison's answer was his kiss, deep and certain and full of promises about the life they would build. At the reception, Marcus Ashford gave a toast that surprised everyone, perhaps himself most of all. "I have been blind," he said, his voice carrying across Mrs. Gardner's garden. "For 22 years I looked at my daughter Theodora and saw only what she wasn't, not beautiful enough, not biddable enough, not the daughter I expected. And in my blindness, I almost destroyed the best thing in my life, the chance to know this brilliant, stubborn, extraordinary woman." He raised his glass to Thea, tears on his cheeks. "Harrison, you're a braver man than I. May you spend your life being challenged and delighted in equal measure." "Thea, my dear, I'm sorry it took a duke to teach me what I should have seen all along. That you were never the difficult daughter. You were always exactly enough." Thea crossed the garden and embraced her father, and for the first time in her life, he held her like she mattered. Later, as evening fell and the wedding guests drifted away, Harrison and Thea stood together in the garden where they'd promised their lives to each other. Rosalie and Augustus had already departed for their own announcement party, an engagement to be celebrated in 3 weeks, when enough time had passed to make it respectable. "What now?" Thea asked, leaning into Harrison's warmth. "Now," Harrison said, "we go home, to my library, our library. And we spend the rest of our lives doing what we started 3 years ago, talking, arguing, building something real. Partnership in everything. Partnership in everything." They walked to the carriage through falling leaves that turned the twilight golden. And Thea Ashford, oh Thea Whitmore. Duchess of Ashford felt the last chains of invisibility fall away. She had been seen. She had been chosen. And most importantly, she had chosen herself. The rest was just beginning. The honeymoon passed in a blur of books and debates and discovery. Harrison's Cambridge townhouse became their sanctuary, a place where they could be entirely themselves, unobserved by Boston society, free from the weight of expectation. Their wedding night was tender, not rushed. Harrison had waited 3 years for this. They took their time. Afterward, they lay in each other's arms talking about Kant until nearly dawn, and Thea realized this was the marriage she'd always wanted without knowing she could have it, intellectual and physical intimacy woven together, inseparable. "You're smiling," Harrison murmured, brushing hair from her face. "What are you thinking?" "That I never have to hide again," Thea said. "That this is real. That tomorrow morning we'll have breakfast and debate politics, and this is my life now." "Our life," Harrison corrected. "Partners, remember. Partners." Thea agreed and kissed him again. 6 weeks in Cambridge transformed Thea in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Harrison resumed his position as visiting lecturer in political philosophy, and Thea attended every lecture sitting in the front row where everyone could see her. The first day, 3 students walked out in protest. By the 3rd week, they stopped noticing her presence. By the 6th week, Harrison invited her to give a guest lecture. "On what topic?" Thea asked, terrified and exhilarated. "Wollstonecraft, of course. What else?" The lecture hall was packed, 200 students, all male, except for her, curious and skeptical, and ready to dismiss her. Thea stood at the lectern in a severe gray dress, not the worst anymore, but simple, serious, and began. "Gentlemen, I stand before you as a contradiction. According to centuries of philosophical tradition, I should not be capable of the rational discourse I'm about to engage in. My sex, you've been taught, precludes serious thought, and yet here I am. The question is, will you let your assumptions prevent you from hearing the argument?" For 90 minutes, she walked them through Wollstonecraft's Vindication, quoting from memory-building arguments, anticipating and dismantling objections. When she finished, the room was silent. Then one student began clapping, then another. Then the entire hall was applauding, and Thea saw tears in Harrison's eyes as he watched from the back. Afterward, a distinguished professor approached her, the same one who had challenged her at Harrison's lecture 3 years ago. "Madam," he said stiffly, "I was wrong about women's capacity for philosophical rigor. You have opened my eyes." It was not a complete victory, but it was a beginning. 3 months after the wedding, Thea and Harrison returned to Boston. Society had used their absence to sharpen its claws, preparing for their return. Mrs. Gardner hosted a reception. 100 guests, the cream of Boston society, gathered to either welcome or eviscerate the unlikely Duchess. Thea entered on Harrison's arm, wearing sapphire silk that matched her ring. Conversation stuttered and restarted. Women who had mocked her at the salon now curtsied and called her Your Grace. Men who had dismissed her opinions now asked what she thought of the latest political developments. Mrs. Peyton approached her daughter, trailing behind, looking sullen. Your Grace, Mrs. Peyton said, the title clearly painful to pronounce. I owe you an apology. I spoke harshly at Mrs. Gardner's salon. I was mistaken about many things. We all operate within the limits of our understanding, Thea said graciously. I hope mine continues expanding. The answer earned respect. Competence and grace, not pettiness. Thea was learning that being seen meant accepting the weight of observation, but also the power of it. Later, Rosalie arrived with Augustus newly engaged. The announcement had been made while Thea was in England, and society had been forced to accept two unconventional matches in the same season. Together, the sisters had rewritten what was possible. You did it, Rosalie whispered, embracing Thea. You taught them that we could choose differently. And we did it together, Thea corrected. That night over dinner at the Ashford townhouse, Marcus made another confession. I've been reading your lecture, he said quietly. The Cambridge Quarterly had published Thea's Wollstonecraft talk, signed Theodora Whitmore, Duchess of Ashford. I didn't know you could write like this. You never asked, Thea said, but without bitterness now, just a fact. No, I didn't. Marcus met her eyes. 22 years in my house, and I never asked what you were reading, what you were thinking, who you were becoming. I saw you as a problem to solve, not a person to know. Can you forgive me? Thea considered the question honestly. I don't forget the years of invisibility, Father, but I see you trying now. That matters. We can build something new, not erase the past, but grow beyond it. Marcus nodded, accepting the boundary she set, not absolution, but possibility. Later, Harrison observed, you didn't let him off easily. No, Thea agreed. Real reconciliation requires real change. Pretty words aren't enough. You're wise, Harrison said. I'm learning, Thea corrected. We both are. 6 months into marriage, Thea missed her monthly courses. She told Harrison over breakfast while they debated Hegel. He dropped his teacup. Thea, are you certain? Reasonably certain, she said, practical as always. I'll confirm with the doctor, but yes, I believe so. Harrison crossed to her chair, knelt beside her, took her hands. Our legacy begins, he whispered. Will you still debate philosophy with me while I'm pregnant? Thea asked, only half joking. Try and stop me, Harrison said, and kissed her, and Thea felt terror and joy in equal measure. The pregnancy was difficult, but not dangerous. Thea continued writing. She and Harrison were co-authoring a pamphlet on universal education until the 8th month when moving became too exhausting. She read constantly, drove Harrison mad with questions about childbirth and infant development, and refused to be treated as fragile. 8.5 months in labor began during a dinner party. Thea was mid-sentence arguing with a visiting Oxford professor about empiricism when the first contraction hit. Gentlemen, she said calmly, I'm afraid we'll have to continue this discussion another time. I'm going into labor. The professor nearly fainted. Harrison went pale. But Thea walked herself upstairs with only Rosalie's assistance and 12 hours later delivered a healthy daughter. Eleanor Catherine Whitmore, Harrison said, holding his newborn child with tears streaming down his face. Named for the past and the future both. Will she be brilliant? Thea asked, exhausted and exhilarated. With you as her mother, Harrison laughed. She'll be unstoppable. 5 years later, 1904. Thea stood at the window of the Ashford Estate Library, watching her daughter Eleanor chase her younger brother Jonathan through the garden. Eleanor was 5 years old, dark-haired like her mother, already asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. Jonathan was one toddling after his sister with determined focus. Mama, Eleanor's voice carried through the open window. Mama, is it fair that I have to share my toys with Jonathan when he can't even talk properly yet? Thea smiled. Come inside and we'll discuss it. Eleanor burst through the library doors, grass-stained and flushed. Harrison followed with Jonathan on his hip, looking amused. Well, Thea said, settling into the chair where she and Eleanor often had these conversations, let's think about fairness. What does fair mean? That everyone gets the same, Eleanor said confidently. Does it? If I gave you the same dinner as Jonathan, would that be fair? Eleanor frowned. No, he doesn't have teeth for meat yet. So fairness isn't always sameness. Sometimes it's giving people what they need, even if that's different things. Does that help you think about sharing toys? Eleanor's face scrunched in concentration. I think so. Jonathan needs toys he can't break, so I should let him have my old wooden blocks, not my good books. Exactly, Thea said. You're learning to think about justice, not just rules. Harrison watched this exchange with visible pride. Later, when the children were napping, he said, "She's exactly like you." "She's like both of us," Thea corrected. "That's the point." They were interrupted by a knock. The butler entered with a letter bearing the seal of Radcliffe College. Thea opened it with shaking hands. "Dear Duchess Ashford, the Board of Trustees of Radcliffe College is pleased to extend an invitation for you to join our faculty as lecturer in philosophy beginning in the fall term. Your published work on educational reform and women's rational capacity has impressed us greatly. We believe you would be an invaluable addition to our mission of providing women with access to classical education. Yours in scholarship, Elizabeth Cary Agassiz." President Thea read it twice, then handed it to Harrison silently. He read, then looked up with shining eyes. "Will you accept? If you'll watch Jonathan during my morning lectures," Thea said. "Partner in everything," Harrison reminded her. "Always." The Blackwood Sterling School for Young Women opened its doors in September 1904, occupying a converted wing of the Ashford family estate. Marcus had donated the space as final act of redemption, giving his granddaughters a future he'd almost denied his daughters. 24 students enrolled in the first class. Rich and poor daughters of merchants and factory workers, united by hunger for knowledge. The curriculum was radical philosophy, political theory, mathematics, sciences, Latin, Greek. Everything a man's classical education included. Thea taught philosophy 3 mornings a week. Rosalie taught art history. Harrison guest lectured on political economy. Augustus taught geography and world cultures. And Marcus surprisingly taught practical business skills, accounting, contract law negotiation. "I may have failed as a father," he told Thea before the school's opening, "but I can try to do better as a teacher." On opening day, Thea stood before 24 young women and said, "You have been told your minds don't matter. That's a lie. You have been told to be decorative, not thoughtful. Reject that. In this school, your ideas have value. Your questions have worth. You have worth. Learn to see yourselves. Then help others see themselves." The students were silent, drinking in every word. One girl raised her hand, Mary O'Brien, daughter of Irish immigrants, brilliant and hungry. "Duchess Ashford, what if we learn all this and the world still won't let us use it?" Then Thea said, "You change the world. That's what education is for, not to fit into the world as it is, but to build the world as it should be." Mary smiled. 3 years later, she would become the first woman admitted to Boston University. 10 years later, he would become a published philosopher. 20 years later, she would credit that opening day speech as the moment her life changed. Legacy multiplies. One scene, woman helping another see herself. The final scene, a crisp October afternoon in 1904, the Ashford Library where it all began. Thea sat in her favorite chair now with a 5-year-old Eleanor curled beside her, looking at the illustrations in a children's book of Greek myths. "Mama," Eleanor asked, "why do you love Papa?" Harrison entered at that moment carrying Jonathan, both of them grass-stained from playing outside. He paused in the doorway, curious to hear the answer. Thea considered the question seriously. Eleanor deserves serious answers. "I love your father," she said, "because he saw me when I was invisible, because he values my mind as much as my heart, because we're partners, equals in everything, and because when I was very scared, he let me wear my worst dress and loved me anyway." "Your worst dress?" Eleanor frowned. "Why would you wear a worse dress?" "To test if he would still see me," Thea explained, "to find out if his love was about who I really was or about what I looked like." "That's silly," Eleanor declared. "Of course he loves who you are. You're the smartest person I know." Harrison crossed the room, set Jonathan down with his wooden blocks, and sat beside Thea. "That worst dress," he said, "was the best thing I ever saw. It told me your mother was brave enough to be herself." "Will I have to wear a worse dress someday?" Eleanor asked. "No," Thea said firmly. "You'll never have to test if you're worthy of being seen because you'll grow up knowing you already are. That's the whole point." Eleanor nodded satisfied and returned to her myths. Thea and Harrison sat together in the library that had witnessed their first real conversation, surrounded by their shared work, co-authored essays, published lectures, the evidence of a partnership that had produced not just children, but ideas, not just a family, but a legacy. Through the window, they could see the converted wing, where 24 young women were learning that their minds mattered, could see the garden where their children played without limitations, could see the future they were building together. "No regrets?" Harrison asked quietly. Thea thought about the gray wool dress, about 3 years of letters, about the terrifying choice to be seen, about 22 years of invisibility that had taught her the value of genuine recognition, about 5 years of marriage that had proven partnership was possible. No regrets, she said, only gratitude. Eleanor looked up from her book. Mama, tell me about Athena. She was the smart one, right? She was the wise one, Thea corrected, which is different from smart. Wisdom means knowing yourself and using your knowledge well. Like you, Eleanor said matter-of-factly. Thea laughed, surprised by tears. I'm learning, we all are. Harrison took her hand. Jonathan babbled at their feet. Eleanor asked another question, and the afternoon light streamed through the library windows, illuminating a family that existed because one woman had dared to test whether being seen was possible, and one man had proven it was. From the Boston Herald. October 15, 1924. Former Radcliffe professor Theodora Whitmore, Duchess of Ashford, died peacefully yesterday at her Cambridge home, surrounded by family. She was 47. The Duchess was best known for her groundbreaking work in philosophy and her tireless advocacy for women's education. She co-founded the Blackwood Sterling School for Young Women, which has educated over 500 young women in classical subjects. She taught at Radcliffe College for 15 years and published extensively on political philosophy and educational reform. She is survived by her husband Harrison Whitmore, Duke of Ashford, her daughter Dr. Eleanor Whitmore Chen, professor of philosophy at Harvard University, her son Jonathan Whitmore, dean of students at the Blackwood Sterling School, 4 grandchildren, and her sister Rosalie Sterling. In lieu of flowers, the family requests donations to the Blackwood Sterling School Scholarship Fund. Services will be held Friday at Trinity Church. In accordance with the Duchess's wishes, her former students will serve as pallbearers, and Dr. Eleanor Whitmore Chen will deliver the eulogy. My mother, Dr. Whitmore Chen, said yesterday, taught me that being seen is not a gift bestowed by others, but a right we claim for ourselves. She spent her life making sure other women knew they could claim it too. That's her legacy, not just the books she wrote or the students she taught, but the countless women who learned from her example that their minds mattered, that they mattered. The Duchess's most famous essay on being seen has been translated into 12 languages and remains required reading in women's colleges across America. In it, she wrote, "For 22 years I spent as a shadow in my own story, but shadows only exist where light is blocked. I did not need to become someone else to be seen. I needed to stand in the light as myself, imperfect, argumentative, stubbornly intellectual. And when I found someone who valued those qualities instead of trying to diminish them, I learned the most important lesson. We teach people how to see us by refusing to make ourselves smaller, by insisting on our right to take up space, to think deeply, to matter. She will be deeply missed by all who knew her and by the thousands who learned from her that being extraordinary is not about being perfect. It's about being authentically, courageously yourself."